Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today, oops, we're going to be taking a look at the first Z370 motherboard I've had in my hands. So this right here is a Z370 Gaming 7 from Gigabyte, and I'd love to put a Coffee Lake CPU in it. I just don't have one yet. And honestly, at the rate things are going, Z390 will be out before I have a Coffee Lake CPU, so yeah, this is just great. But, yeah, we are going to be taking a look at this board. So here it is, you know, fully assembled because I've pulled all the screws out of it. And we're just going to do a basic physical overview. I'm not going to go into, well, actually I'm going to go into a decent amount of depth, but not going to worry with like power dissipation numbers for the various components because, again, well, A, you don't need to worry about it. B, this motherboard's going to be irrelevant in like 2 months. So, yeah. Anyway, let's get right into it. So, first of all, the I/O cover thing is, in fact, a two-piece. So, this is a really good thing because if you like the aesthetic of this part up here, you can keep that and you can remove this part down here separately, which I've not unscrewed that one. But this, I've seen some GPUs have... like, some GPUs will not actually, like, seat in the PCIe slots if you have your, if you have this cover over here. So making it removable is actually a good idea because it tends to be a bit too tall in a lot of cases. So, yeah, and I really should stop drinking energy drinks right before I make videos, but, well, sorry. Yeah, so that's the I/O cover. Now, the I/O cover has a little sort of secret fan which I find kind of interesting is that well, basically this will pull air in from like outside the case and blow it against the back of the VRM heatsink. So it does ensure that your VRM has some airflow over it at all times. It is a very, very small fan, and I'm not sure how loud it gets. Also, this just, like, the assembly on this thing looks kind of like it was an afterthought. Like, they initially didn't plan to have anything like this on the motherboard, and then they were like, oh, wait, this lovely VRM heatsink we have is actually not running cool enough. Let's add a fan in here. And I'm basing that off of the fact that, like, they're using, like, literally just, you know... Those are just like those are literally just hex nuts on the screws there, which is just like you'd think they'd have threaded the actual bracket that they have, but nope, that's just straight holes. But still, at least the board does have some airflow over the VRM. Though I'd prefer it if, you know, the VRM didn't actually need a fan to get its cooling. And the thing is, that would probably have been possible if it wasn't for these lovely artistic, you know, bits of aluminum on top of the heat sinks, because if you look down the side, you can see there's actually surface area down there. Except, you know, there's no way there's going to be any airflow through that area, because there's a great big aluminum plate over it. Which is just like, yeah. Oh, and this one has RGB jammed in there. You can sort of see a, you know, plastic piece. So this all lights up. And that light bar, you know, obviously harms VRM cooling, so yeah. The heatsink itself is reasonably heavy, you know, it looks like it has a decent amount of surface area if you actually pulled off the airflow restrictors, as well as the, you know, the RGB. There's a heat pipe in here, which basically the only thing the heat pipe is doing is it's going to be sharing the heat from, because the way this VRM is set up is it's an 8-phase, we'll get to that. But basically you have these 6 phases down here, those are vCore, and then you have 2 more phases for vCore, and then you have 2 more phases for iGPU. So it's an 8+2. And so the 6 phases of vCore, like those will be the ones running hottest, right? Because they're all next to each other. So it'll basically share heat out into from those up into the upper heatsink section, which, like, the iGPU phases basically won't be running for, like, if you're not using the iGPU, those 2 phases literally don't do anything, so those will literally not be producing heat in a lot of scenarios. So it's so it's actually really useful that the 6 phases that do a lot of work get to use the iGPU's heatsink. So that's what the heat pipe is there for. So like this is just like, this looks like a relatively solid heatsink. Just these covers I have, like I might actually go and test that. Like not super seriously, mind you. I'll just like run one test with the covers on and then covers off and just see if it makes a difference. It should make a pretty big difference. Obviously, if you have it horizontal, then these covers are probably an absolute disaster. If you have the board like this, then you could argue that convection would make air rise through that just naturally, but that's still going to be, like, if there's air moving this way because of fans or whatever in the system, and you have this cover here, then that cover is just going to be, like, definitely going to be lowering VRM cooling efficiency. So, yeah. Heatsink is, like, this is probably a decent heatsink if it didn't also have all the artistic accessories on it. Though, the good news is this board probably, like, actually, this board does just fine in terms of VRM cooling, and I know this for a fact because Der Bauer tested this board earlier, and I think he only ever saw it max out at, like, 90s on the MOSFETs, so that's fine. 90s are fine. It was when you start going over 100 that it starts being a problem, especially if you go a lot past 100. But this VRM could obviously, like, honestly, if the heatsink was good enough, this VRM should be running in the 70s. And the reason why I'm saying that is these power stages right here. So, and I'm not on the... You know what? I need to get that... Oh no, because it flickers like crazy. Oh well. Anyway, those power stages right there are Intersil ISL 99-22-7. No. No, they aren't 99-22-7s. They should be. Let me check. Because I have the, like, I know for a fact that I have the three the three numbers in the part number correct. I just don't know if I have the number of each of them correct. Let me just, ISL 99. Yeah, 99-22-7. Yeah, it's the ISL 99-22-7. That's a 60 amp power stage. It is not just your regular typical power stage, it is a smart power stage. And the reason why it's so smart is because it integrates things like temperature monitoring, temperature protection, current monitoring, current protection, and well, that's basically it. There's not that much functionality that a VRM, like, you know, that you can tack onto a VRM beyond the usual stuff. Yeah, but these integrate temperature, thermal protection and overcurrent protection. The overcurrent protection is set at 90 amps for each of them, and their average output, like their rated average output current is 60 amps, assuming you can cool the amount of heat they produce, which at 60 amps, these will be producing about 12 watts of heat each, depending on what voltage you're actually outputting, but roughly around 12 watts for each of them. So if you actually tried to push 60 amps through the 8-phase V-core, well, through each of the 8 phases, so 480 amps combined, this would get really, really hot. Okay, it would get very, very hot, as you'd be pushing something like 96 watts of heat for the VRM combined. But what you have to keep in mind is that, well, Coffee Lake doesn't pull that much current. It is power hungry. But a Coffee Lake 6-core doing like 5.1 gigahertz, you're going to be looking at about 140 amps under Prime 95. So, you know, and by Prime 95, I mean like Blender as well. If you're doing like 3D modeling and rendering that, then that's a very similar, especially if it, well, the latest version of Blender uses AVX acceleration, and it also depends on what rendering engine you use. But if you have one that uses AVX acceleration, it can get very, very close in terms of power consumption to what Prime 95 does. But even under those workloads, you're still going to be looking at around 140, 150 amps V-core VRM output, so that's like 1/4 the total output capacity of the VRM. And so the VRM shouldn't actually get that hot, even though it will be pushing a hell of a lot of current. So, yeah, and the V-core VRM is an 8-phase, and, you know, we have 10 phases total here, and you might be thinking, okay, so, well, nobody makes an 8 plus 2-phase voltage controller, so how the hell are we getting this, 8 plus 2-phase VRM setup? Well, the voltage controller here is actually an Intercell 69138, which is not even an 8-phase proper voltage controller. It's a 7-phase, and it does anything from like a 4 plus 3 to a 7 plus 0, so you can do like a 6 plus 1, 5 plus 2, 4 plus 3, you get the idea. And you can also do things like a 4 plus 0 or a 4 plus 2. And here the ISL 69138 is configured for a 4 plus 2, but there is a very special chip on the back of this board. Well, it's not that special, it's a type of doubler, but it's a much smarter doubler than what you normally get. These right here are Intersil ISL 6617s. And the really, really cool thing about these guys is that they do current balancing. And so they can, like, the main feature that you have with like a proper true 8-phase is that the voltage controller can actually monitor each individual phase and make sure that all of the phases are pushing the same amount of current, or that they are thermally balanced, depending on what the voltage controller is configured to do and what kind of capabilities it has. But here with the ISLs, and generally speaking, the focus is getting current balance across all the phases. Now with the ISL 6617s, these chips actually do that for each of the 2 phases that they have hooked up to them. So the voltage controller still sees a 4-phase, because it literally doesn't have more inputs than 4 for the vCore section. So that still sees a 4-phase, but the ISL 6617s, each of them is actually capable of taking a PWM signal from the voltage controller and changing the actual duty cycle for the given phase to make sure that they are as close to balance as possible. So that's really, really cool. And basically this makes this an 8-phase. This is an 8-phase. Like, as far as I'm concerned, this counts as a true 8-phase. You couldn't really get much, this wouldn't really register as any different from a proper 8-phase in any way, shape, or form. It's better than like what you normally see on like, a lot of other boards, what they'll do is they'll use International Rectifier 3599s. And the thing about the 3599 is it's a perfectly good doubler, and it's also a quadrupler. But the way that chip works is it literally just takes your PWM signal and it trades it between the 2 phases. It doesn't actually, like, if phase 1 is pushing, 10 amps more than phase 2, so one of them is doing like 20 amps and the other one is doing 30, it still just trades the PWM signal between them. It literally does not care how much current each one is pushing. And the voltage controller isn't aware that there's a difference in the amount of current going through either of those phases. With the 6617, the 6617 actually has logic built into it so that it monitors the current on each of the phases and outputs a sum of the currents to the actual voltage controller, but for its own doubling purposes, it will compare the current going through each phase against the average across the phases, and it will change the duty cycle for the PWM signal depending on which, so that the phases basically hit the same average current. So if it sees like a situation where one phase is pushing 20 amps and the other one is pushing 30, it'll basically make the 20 amp phase, give the 20 amp phase longer duty cycles so that it gets up to the same current output as the 30 amp phase. Or, well, the 30 amp phase will start to come down once you start doing that kind of imbalance. But basically, it'll do its best to keep the phases balanced, which is something a lot of other doublers can't do at all. Or the way they can do it is very, very limited. Like, some chips will literally just skip a phase. Like, if they see a big... And the problem with that system is that you need a big current difference. So it doesn't work if you have like 20 amps versus 30. It only works if you have like 20 amps versus 40, or 60 amps on one phase and 20 amps on the other one. Yeah, then it makes sense to literally just skip one phase, give the 20 amp phase 2 sets of PWM pulses. So for a little bit, that one's like running at higher switching frequency than it normally would be. But anyway, so this is a really, really good doubling scheme. This is an 8-phase. So that's that. So that's cool. The ISL 60, the actual power stages themselves, also really, really high-end parts. And one feature I sort of forgot to mention about them is that they have an exposed metal top. Now, first of all, that metal top is not ground, but it does significantly help with thermal dissipation, because it is normally the casing of a MOSFET like is an epoxy, and so that's not super, thermally conductive. So these have a metal casing, and that is actually really, really thermally conductive. The downside is there's going to be 12 volts on that, and there's going to be V-core on that as well. So it has voltage on there. And if for some reason you like broke through the thermal pad and that made contact with the VRM heatsink, there's like a good chance you're going to end up with a really bad short circuit. So that's like the main like that's the main downside to using these. But they do run a lot cooler because they do have this this exposed metal top. So that's a really cool feature. And these are also really expensive power stages. These are like last time I was checking the prices for these, they were about $5 a piece. And that was if you were buying them in like bulk orders of 3,000 units. So these aren't cheap, and they're generally only used on X299 boards. As far as I'm, well, and some ITX motherboards where like, well, because the thing is, if you're on an ITX motherboard, it's like, well, the VRM can't be physically big, so you need to do everything within your power to minimize the amount of heat output. And one of the ways to do that is to use really, really high-end, power stages. And yeah, so basically these are really, really, like, this is a really solid VRM. Also, the chokes Gigabyte is using here, those are, they've used these on some other boards as well. And off the top of my head, these max out at 60 amps output. Basically, this VRM is totally overkill for, yeah, they're like 60 amps at 125 and 70 amps at 25. So basically, they derate as they get hot. But either way, these are also really, really high-end chokes, which is neat as well. And basically, it means that this VRM, you don't have to ever worry about, like, a 8700K should have no chance of overloading this VRM. Like, even on liquid nitrogen, this VRM should be perfectly good. So, yeah, I'm happy that I have at least this board, though I still don't have an 8700K to put it in, so, that's not going anywhere. That's the V-core and the iGPU. The iGPU is using the same power stages. Now, below that, we find these two phases, yes, but they're actually separate VRMs, and they do have input filtering, which is this is something I've noticed about Gigabyte boards. Gigabyte tends to go really overboard with like having inductors on the input side of like every single VRM. Like one of these is VCCSA and the other one is VCCIO, right? Neither of these is a particularly high power rail, and there's, so you have your output inductor, which is the one that actually does your voltage conversion, but then there's the input one, and that one basically exists just to suppress the switching noise that goes from the VRM to the, I think this is actually running off of 5 volts. It's not running off of 12. Or is it running off of 12? I can't remember right now, but either way, basically it blocks the switching noise to the high voltage rail that those are running off of. And this is just something like I've noticed that Gigabyte seems to do, where like they have the same thing for this phase down here, which I assume is VPP. Then they have another, like this is, this is before, like this is the actual output choke for the memory VRM. There's an input one. And it's just like, and they do this everywhere. And I noticed this also on the Z370 N Gaming 5, the little ITX board. It was like, there was these tiny little like chokes just crammed everywhere on the board, and it was just like, well, I mean, like the impact of these, I'd say, is probably very marginal in terms of what they do for your overclocking, but it is a kind of sort of a nice touch in a way, because it's just more overkill is more better. So you can't really complain that they're doing that they're putting more input filtering on each of the VRMs. Now, anyway, back to the VCCSA and VCCIO. So the VCCSA and VCCIO are both controlled by Richtech 8120 voltage control. 81. Yeah, 8120 voltage controllers. These are single phase. There's nothing special. But VCCIO and VCCSA are low current rails, so you don't need anything super amazing on them. The MOSFETs are on semiconductor 4C10N MOSFETs in the reduced package size. They're completely adequate for like these power output levels, because they are much smaller and they are low. Like they're not even in their full size package. These aren't great MOSFETs, but the thing is, VCCIO and VCCSA, you're never going to see either of those rails go much above 10 amps. So perfectly adequate there. The voltage controllers, I'm not going to complain about that either. Though there are definitely motherboards where, like, I think ASRock has some boards where they have two-phase system agent, which the system agent pulls a little bit more than the I/O. So, yeah, and there's actually I think ASRock has a few boards where their I/O and SAVRM is basically like a full vCore phase, and it's just like on a different voltage controller, which is really, really overkill, but that's just kind of an ASRock thing to do, where it's, you just do really, really overkill minor rail VRMs for no apparent reason. Whereas Gigabyte, well, I think the thing is Gigabyte also uses these MOSFETs on a bunch of other motherboards, so it just makes sense that they already have piles and piles of them, so that they have the option to choose to use these. Either way, the next thing I'd like to draw attention to is not the Turbo B clock, though that is, well, basically that's just an external clock gen to allow you to push the BCLK really, really, really high. Because regularly, Kaby Lake and Skylake CPUs, they already have a separate, like, the Intel, actually no, this is Coffee Lake, but it's still, Coffee Lake, Skylake, Kaby Lake, same damn thing. One of them just has more cores. But with Skylake, Intel went and separated the BCLK from the rest of the, well, not completely, but they basically did some changes to the internals of the CPU to make it possible to clock the BCLK way up there. So you can actually overclock the BCLK really, really high on like Skylake, Kaby Lake, Coffee Lake CPUs. You can crank up the BCLK. And it doesn't affect your PCIe, SATA, and SATA stability, which is really, really nice. But if for some reason you but the stock max frequency I think is like 160 megahertz or something. It goes high, but it doesn't go super high. So these external clock gens exist for when you want to push the BCLK to like 200 megahertz plus, which is completely pointless because there's no performance benefit to doing it this way. But it is a nice feature to have on a board. Now, above the Turbo B clock, you actually have three low dropout regulators. These are 3 amps each. They're from Richtech, and they are 9018s, yeah, so RT9018s. And the reason why these are on the board is basically for VCCPLL-OC, and I think VCCPLL and VCCDMI, I want to say. Basically, these exist to supply the extreme overclocking voltages. So there's a few voltages on Skylake, Kaby Lake, Coffee Lake, which if you don't have control over them, the CPU doesn't work under minus 120 because those circuits won't fire up if you don't give them a crap ton more voltage. So these LDOs basically exist to allow you to push the voltages for those push those voltages really, really high so that you can actually remove cold boot bugs and cold bugs. So these are absolutely necessary for extreme overclocking, and it's really, really nice to actually have them on the board. So yeah, I figured I'd just point them out. And I do actually intend to, well, there's a good chance that if I get an 8700K sometime soon, I won't have a different board to run it on than this one, so this thing might end up on LN2. And, you know, the only real complaint I have is that it's a 4-DIMM motherboard, not a 2-DIMM. Because since it is a 4-DIMM, it's going to be kind of weaker at memory overclocking, but I will be testing out how well that does, how well it does there. Other OC features you have a power button, a button you should never press, there's a clear CMOS and a reset button, and I can't remember which one's which. This jumper doesn't do anything useful, it's just for changing your RGB LED voltage levels, I want to say. Yeah, it's for changing RGB LED voltage levels, so completely bloody useless. The memory VRM is a bunch of 4C10N? No, 4C06s. Oh wait, was I wrong? Okay, no, these aren't 4C10s. These are 4C06N MOSFETs. Very similar to the 4C10. So I'm sticking by that. And these are full-size 4C06s. Same RT8120 voltage controller for the single-phase memory VRM. I'm not going to complain about that. Like, you know, there are some boards which come with two-phase memory power. I've not noticed any major difference in like, I've had single-phase memory power motherboards which do really, really well in memory overclocking, like beating out two-phase memory power. So honestly, it's just, well, the thing is DDR4 doesn't pull any power, so it's not like you need a ton of phases to power it. Which is, yeah, so the single phase there, not going to complain about that. Because, you know, it's fine. Like, you don't need more. One thing I will complain about, they put the postcode in the wrong bloody place on the board. You see, all the buttons are up here, but then they put the postcode there. So there's like no good orientation for having this motherboard on a test bench. The other thing is, if you run three-way crossfire, which this motherboard doesn't officially support, but it will work because crossfire is awesome, and basically as long as there's enough PCIe slots, you can run crossfire three-way, four-way, like, yeah, you can run three-way crossfire off of this. So if you do run three-way crossfire, you're not going to be able to see that postcode because there will be a great big freaking graphics card right over it. So not a fan of that being down there, because that is actually a, well, I'll run into a problem with that because I might run three-way. Actually, I could probably run four-way off of this board now that I think about it. HD 7990, 7970, 7950. There. I can run four-way off of this. So, actually, I think the 7950... Nah, I can definitely fit that. I just need to get the right heatsinks for that. So, yeah. I think that covers it. I miss anything? There's the I/O section. I mean, you can just look at the motherboard page for that, though. Gone over the VRM, gone over the buttons, the LDOs for your extreme overclocking, postcode we've covered. Is there anything else I wanted to mention? Nah, I can't think of anything. So, yeah, I'm excited to like get to run this board. Mostly because I'm just excited to get to run Coffee Lake, not necessarily this board. But I will say that I am, I am very impressed that Gigabyte opted for these like super high-end power stages for the V-Core VRM, and yeah, instead of like doing something silly like building a 16-phase with garbage MOSFETs and then going like, but more phases, more better, like, yeah. So this is definitely a really solid V-Core VRM right there. Oh yeah, you do get dual BIOS as usual, and there is no dual BIOS control switch, which kind of sucks. So the dual BIOS on this board is one of the, you know, the automatic Gigabyte implementation where if you mess up your main BIOS, the backup one will overwrite it. The issue with that functionality is sometimes the automated BIOS restore system will actually get a little bit confused. And so even if you don't screw up your main BIOS, it'll go and write over it anyway. And so on their, like, on the really high-end, you know, overclocking focused motherboards from Gigabyte, you actually get switches to disable the automatic BIOS, the automatic dual BIOS mode, because the automatic mode, like most automatic things, sometimes screws up. And then and if you're really pushing memory hard, it can get pretty annoying in some scenarios where it's like you fail to post a few times and it just, you know, it wipes the BIOS, and then you fail to post a few times again and it wipes the BIOS. And so, yeah, it is like, that is the one feature that I feel like this board could have added that would have made me like it a lot more. Voltage read points would have also been nice, but hey, it's not meant for extreme overclocking. I'm actually surprised they even bothered with the LDOs on this board, because honestly, like, this thing is so, like, it is, well, I don't know, it's, well, I guess you could say like ROG being Republic of Gamers should be like so gaming focused, but like I feel like with Gigabyte that's more true that they're like, because there's just RGB everywhere, right? You have RGB PCIe slots, RGB memory slots, RGB VRM heatsinks, RGB I/O covers, and then it's like you have this RGB strip along the edge of the board, and then it's like, oh, and we also shoved in voltage controllers specifically for extreme overclocking, and it's just like, well, that's nice. I mean, I'll take it. But, yeah, so it's like, so that's kind of that. That's my thoughts on the board. I don't know. I don't really have that many thoughts. Well, I have a lot of thoughts on it. I'm just not really sure what to think of it overall. But overall, I like it. You know, it's not an extreme overclocking focused motherboard, but it should be really, really solid. Though I really hope that, well, when I pull off these like the covers off of the VRM heatsink, if I see a major temperature difference, I'm gonna be really, really disappointed. Then on the flip side, as long as the VRM isn't overheating, I guess do whatever, because that's kind of how we got to this situation where most VRM heatsinks are modern art pieces rather than actual heatsinks. It's because Intel on the Z87, the VRM does so little work. It needs to push very little current, and so basically the motherboard makers realize, hey, we can get away with literally anything, because the VRM on on Z87, most motherboards don't need a VRM heatsink at all. And so the motherboard vendors were like, oh, well, since we don't even need a heatsink, we don't need to design a good one. We can just make, whatever, and it'll still work. And now we have like Z270, and Z270 wasn't really that power hungry, but Z370 is another, 30, 40, 50% more current draw than Z270 for a given voltage. And now we're going to have, on Z390, I expect to see an 8-core, and that's going to be another, 50 amps on top of the 50 amps, like the 150 that Coffee Lake can do in some scenarios. There's going to be another 50 amps on top of that. And, well, the modern art pieces are going to stop being adequate very, very quick, because that amount of power draw is basically in line with what you would see on something like X90, that amount of current draw is in line with what you would see on like maxed out X99. So, yeah. That's it for the video. Sorry for making it unnecessarily long. But yeah, I just wanted to get this board out of the way, because it's, like, I've had it sitting disassembled on a... Story time's over. Thanks for watching. I'm not going to finish that, because if I do try to finish... Well, you get the point. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave comments or questions or anything down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a PayPal, a Patreon, and there's t-shirts you can buy. You can find a link to all of that down in the description below. I need to, like... The t-shirt situation is kind of a mess. Because Teespring is a bit of a mess, so I need to reorganize all of that, but you can still get most of the shirts. Most of them are available in well, that's not actually true. Whatever. But the link to the shirts, once it starts working, is down in the description below. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.